The emergency room had 43 patients that Tuesday morning, doctors rushing, monitors screaming, gurneys colliding in narrow hallways. And in the middle of that beautiful, practiced chaos, one man was dying in absolute silence, and nobody saw it but her. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even on the trauma rotation. She was the nurse everyone laughed at during morning rounds, the one Dr. Hale had called a liability waiting to happen just 40 minutes earlier. But when she crossed that room and dropped to her knees beside that gurney, her hands didn't shake. Not even once. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories we tell on this channel don't go where you expect them to go. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday morning in Harlan Falls, Montana, and meet the nurse nobody thought was worth remembering. The thing about Redstone Valley Medical Center was that it smelled like disinfectant and bad decisions. The hallways were too narrow for the volume of patients they pushed through every shift, and the overhead lighting had that particular institutional buzz that lodged itself behind your eyes after 6 hours and didn't leave until you slept. Claire Dawson had worked there for 2 years and 4 months, which was long enough to know every broken drawer in the supply closet, every shortcut through the back corridor near radiology, and exactly which vending machine would eat your dollar without apology. She arrived at 6:45 that morning with coffee she'd made at home because the break room machine was still broken from last Thursday, and she already knew, before she even clocked in, that it was going to be one of those days. There was a system to reading a shift before it started. You checked the board. You counted the gurneys in the hallway. You listened to how loud the nurses at the station were talking. If they were loud, it meant the night crew hadn't slept and was burning through their last reserves of composure. That morning, they were very loud. Dawson, the charge nurse, Petra Wolf, didn't look up from the clipboard. You're on bay 3 through 6. 2 discharges pending, 1 chest pain still waiting on labs, and there's a walk-in with a hand lac that's been there since 5. Got it. Claire took the clipboard, scanned the notes. The chest pain patient was 62, hypertensive, presented with atypical symptoms. She made a mental note to check the EKG herself when she had a minute. She was halfway to bay 3 when she heard him. Dr. Victor Hale's voice carried the way voices do when they're accustomed to rooms falling quiet. He was standing at the nursing station with 2 residents flanking him like they were afraid to be anywhere else, holding a chart in one hand and looking at it the way surgeons sometimes looked at things they found mildly beneath them. Where is the Novak intake form? He wasn't asking anyone in particular. That was the thing about Hale. He spoke at rooms, not to people. This should have been completed on admission. Why is it sitting here unfinished? I can check on that, Dr. Hale, one of the residents said. I don't need you to check on it. I need it done. He set the chart down with precisely enough force to make a statement without being dramatic. Then he looked up and saw Claire, and something in his expression shifted into a particular kind of flat, assessing irritation. Dawson, she stopped. Good morning. Did you complete the Novak intake? I just came on shift. That's not what I asked. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to be honest, short enough to avoid the conversation he was trying to start. No, I wasn't here for the Novak admission. He made a small sound that wasn't quite a word and picked the chart back up. Typical. He said it like it was directed at the chart, but it wasn't. One of the residents caught her eye with an expression that lived somewhere between sympathy and relief that it wasn't him. And Claire turned and walked to bay 3. She'd heard that particular brand of dismissal before. She'd heard it in different rooms, from different people wearing different versions of authority. What she'd learned, and what had taken longer to learn than she would ever admit, was that fighting it directly was usually the least efficient response. The chart still needed updating. The patient in bay 3 still needed to be assessed. The hand lac in the waiting room was still bleeding, so she put her coffee on the supply cart, pulled on gloves, and got to work. The morning moved the way mornings in the ER moved, in surges, not waves. 40 minutes of manageable chaos, then a lull, then something new. By 8:30, the chest pain patient had gone to cardiology, both discharges had cleared, and the hand lac had been sutured and sent home with printed wound care instructions and a prescription for antibiotics. Claire was finishing documentation on bay 4 when Petra appeared at the curtain. Multi-vehicle on Route 9. EMS says at least 7 coming in, 2 critical. All hands. The lull was over. They came in fast and hard. Commercial vehicle, 2 passenger cars. The physics of highway speed doing what physics always did. Claire took the second critical patient, a man in his late 30s, no ID, wearing civilian clothes over what she could tell, even in the chaos of transfer, were military-issue undergarments. Dog tags had been removed or lost. He had significant chest trauma, a probable tension pneumothorax on the left side, and a head laceration that was bleeding cleanly, which meant it looked worse than it was. His blood pressure when EMS handed him off was 84/60 and dropping. "Bay 1, she called. "I need a chest tray and I need it now." The resident assigned to her was young, 3rd year, and good enough under pressure. She'd worked with him before. His name was Torres, and he moved fast when he needed to. "Tracheal deviation," Claire said, positioning her hands. "Left side. We need to decompress." "I'll get Dr. Hale. There's no time." She'd already located the second intercostal space. "Get the tray." He hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was the right amount of time to hesitate, and then he got the tray. The decompression was clean. The patient's pressure came back up within 3 minutes. Not to where it needed to be, but enough. Enough to work with. Enough to get him stable for imaging. It was during the controlled rush toward the CT corridor that it happened. She was moving alongside the gurney, one hand on the rail, watching the monitors mounted to the portable unit, and she felt it before she heard it. That particular quality of stillness that was wrong. Not quiet. Not the patient sleeping or sedating. Something else. The waveform on the pulse oximeter had gone flat in a way that didn't trigger the audible alarm immediately because the adhesive sensor had partially detached during transport and the machine was still trying to recalibrate. Everyone else was moving. Torres was talking to radiology on his radio. The orderly pushing the gurney was focused on the corridor junction ahead. Claire was watching the patient's face. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. She said very clearly, "Stop." The gurney stopped. "He's arresting." Torres looked at the monitor. "The alarm isn't..." The sensor slipped. She was already repositioning. "He's arresting. Call it." There was a beat. A half-second of the kind of doubt that lives in the space between someone's training and their instinct. And then Torres called it, and the corridor became something else entirely. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that looks like the television version of medicine, all clean choreography and meaningful eye contact. It was hard, and it was loud, and it required 3 people holding things at angles that strained your shoulders. And at one point, the portable crash cart locked its wheels on a floor seam and had to be physically wrestled back into position. But the patient's heart came back. It came back ragged and fast, and with the stubborn inconvenience of someone who wasn't done yet. And when the monitor stabilized, Claire stood up straight and pressed the back of her wrist against her forehead and breathed. The corridor was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Dr. Hale arrived. He'd come from Trauma Bay 2, still gloved, and he took in the scene with the practice scan of someone who assessed situations for power dynamics before he assessed them for clinical information. His eyes moved from the patient to the monitor to Torres and then to Claire. "What happened?" he said. Torres explained. He did it accurately and quickly, the way good residents did, and Claire appreciated it even before she saw Hale's expression shift into something she recognized as the specific kind of anger that came from not being the first person in the room when something went right. "You performed a decompression without attending authorization," Hale said. He was looking at Claire. "The patient had a tension pneumo and no time. That's not your call to make." "With respect, Dr. Hale, he was dying." "You are a nurse." He said the word the way some people said it, not as a descriptor, but as a ceiling. "Your job is to support the clinical team, not to override it." Torres started to speak. Hale cut him off with a look. "This will be documented," Hale said to Claire. "A protocol deviation of this kind has to go through the department head. This isn't finished." He walked back toward Trauma Bay 2. Claire looked at Torres, who was looking at his shoes with the expression of someone who had strong opinions he had not yet decided it was safe to have. She peeled off her gloves, dropped them in the waste bin, and said, "Let's get him to CT." The shift continued because shifts continued regardless of what happened in the corridors. By 11 o'clock, the rush from the highway accident had processed through the department, Most of the beds had cycled, and the particular exhausted recalibration of a trauma surge had settled into the staff like weather. Claire ate lunch in the break room at 11:20, half a sandwich, the other half wrapped for later, and read the morning's lab results on her tablet, while a conversation happened around her that she was not part of. This was normal. She was not unfriendly exactly, but she was private in the way that some people were private, which was to say that small talk cost her something she couldn't always afford to spend. Her phone had a message from her sister asking about Thanksgiving plans. She typed back, "Still figuring out the schedule. I'll call this week." She meant it. She also knew she probably wouldn't call until Friday. Petra appeared at the break room door. "Dawson, the military patient from this morning, the unidentified one from the highway. There are some people here asking about him." Claire set down her sandwich. "What kind of people?" "The kind," Petra said, "that don't carry hospital visitor badges." She found them in the family consultation area near the ICU, where they'd been directed by someone who clearly hadn't known where else to put them. There were 3 of them, and they were not in uniform, but they didn't need to be. The way they occupied space, efficient, oriented, aware of every entrance, was a language Claire understood without processing consciously. The one who spoke first was tall, mid-40s, with the kind of stillness that came from very long practice. He introduced himself as Major Ethan Cross, said it like it was a fact he was reporting rather than offering, and showed credentials that were more specific than civilian law enforcement. "We're here regarding the patient admitted this morning from the Route 9 accident," he said. "The unidentified male. We have reason to believe he's one of ours. I can connect you with patient services and the attending. I'd rather speak with you." He said it without inflection, which made it neither rude nor warm. It was simply a preference stated as one. "You were the primary nurse on his admission." "I was." "You also performed a field decompression in the corridor approximately 2 hours ago." She looked at him. "That's in the incident report." "I know, I've read the incident report." He paused. "I'm more interested in the things that aren't in it." He gestured toward the chairs. "Would you sit down for a minute?" She sat because it was the efficient choice, not because she was comfortable with the direction of this. He sat across from her. The other 2 remained standing near the door, facing out. "The patient's vitals on transfer," Cross said. "EMS noted you requested a specific medication draw before you had imaging results. I was working from clinical presentation. You identified a tension pneumo in a moving vehicle corridor with a partially detached sensor and a monitor still recalibrating." I was watching his face. Cross looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been in emergency nursing?" 2 years, 4 months. "And before that?" The question landed in the room like something that had been waiting to be asked. Claire kept her face where it was. "Graduate school," she said. "And before that, undergraduate. University of Oregon." "Anything between undergrad and grad school?" "I took some time." He nodded slowly, the way people nodded when they were cataloging rather than agreeing. "Do you know who the patient is?" "No, he came in without identification." "He's a staff sergeant attached to a classified support unit. His name isn't something I can share with you right now." Cross leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. "What I can tell you is that he wasn't supposed to be on that highway. His transport route was changed at the last minute through a chain of authorizations that we're currently trying to verify, and the vehicle he was in didn't swerve off the road because of a tire blowout." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the crash was deliberate," she said. "I'm saying we're not ruling that out." He paused. "He's alive because of what you did in that corridor, which means whoever wanted him dead didn't get what they wanted." The room was very still. From the ICU bay down the hall, she could hear the steady rhythm of monitors, the distant intercom, the ordinary machinery of a hospital doing what hospitals did. She'd been listening to those sounds for 2 years and 4 months. They'd never sounded quite like this before. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Cross studied her face with the precision of someone taking measurements. "Right now, just to know one thing." He folded his hands. "Where did you learn to move like that?" Before she could answer, the door to the consultation room opened, and Dr. Victor Hale walked in wearing the expression of a man who had just been told something was happening on his floor without his approval. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing Cross with the formal courtesy he kept for people he'd identified as authority. "But I'm going to need to ask what's going on here and why my nursing staff is being—" "Dr. Hale." Cross stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his posture in any way that was aggressive. He simply stood, and something in the room shifted. This conversation is between myself and Ms. Dawson. The hospital administration has been notified through the appropriate channels. He looked at Hale for exactly long enough. You'll receive a full briefing when we have something to share. Hale looked at Claire. The look said several things, none of them kind. Then he looked back at Cross, made a decision that was clearly uncomfortable for him, and left. Cross sat back down. I have a second question now, he said. Claire waited. Whatever you were before you got here, he said quietly. Was it worth it? The question wasn't what she'd expected. She sat with it for a moment, really sat with it, the way she hadn't in a long time. And outside in the hallway, the ICU monitors kept their steady rhythm, and somewhere on the other side of a wall a machine was marking time in clean, even beats, and the patient who should have died twice that morning was still breathing. Ask me again when I know he's going to be okay, she said. Cross almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it was close. He reached into his jacket and set a card on the table between them, plain government issue, with a number handwritten on the back. Don't go home tonight, he said. Not to your usual place. Claire looked at the card, then at him. Why? He was already standing, already signaling to the two men at the door. Because the people who put that man in the path of an 18-wheeler this morning, he said, know that he's still alive. He buttoned his jacket. And they're going to want to know why. He walked out of the consultation room and down the hallway without looking back, and Claire sat alone at the table with a plain white card and a half-eaten sandwich waiting for her in the break room, and the very specific understanding that the shift she was still technically in the middle of had just become something she didn't have a protocol for. She picked up the card. On the back, in ballpoint pen, was a number and 2 words, call tonight. She put the card in her scrubs pocket, stood up, and walked back out into the hospital, back into the noise and the light and the ordinary ongoing emergency of it, because the patient in Bay 3 still needed his 4 o'clock vitals checked, and whatever else was happening, that was still her job. But her hands, as she pushed through the ICU corridor door, were not shaking. They had not shaken once today, and somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that she'd spent 2 years and 4 months trying to keep very quiet, something had recognized the weight of what Cross had said and was already, without her permission, beginning to assess the exits. She didn't call that night, not because she'd decided not to. She hadn't decided anything. She'd finished her shift at 7:15, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room with the broken latch on the 3rd door, driven to the grocery store on Kellerman Avenue because she was out of coffee and eggs, and stood in the cereal aisle for 4 minutes holding a box of something she didn't want before she accepted that her brain was not actually processing the task at hand. She put the box back, bought the coffee and the eggs and a bag of rice she didn't need, drove to her apartment on Birch Street, which was not her usual place in the sense that she'd moved there 8 months ago from the studio across town, and nobody from work knew the new address because she hadn't told anyone and hadn't had a particular reason to until tonight. She sat at the kitchen table with the card in front of her and ate eggs she'd scrambled without tasting them and looked at the 2 words on the back, call tonight, and thought about what Cross hadn't said, which was more informative than what he had. He hadn't said she was in danger. He'd said don't go home, which was not the same thing, but it was close enough that she'd already checked the deadbolt twice and was sitting with her back to the wall facing the door, which was a habit she'd thought she'd broken. Apparently not. She called at 9:47. He picked up on the 2nd ring. Dawson, you already knew it was me. Different number than your hospital file, but yes. A pause. You went somewhere else tonight. I moved 8 months ago. The address in the file is old. I know. I found the new one this afternoon. He said it without apology. I wasn't having you followed. We needed to know the staff we were in contact with were secure. And am I? Secure? More than you probably think. Another pause, shorter. How are you doing? The question surprised her. She hadn't expected it to be the first thing he asked, and the fact that it was told her something about him that she filed away without examining too closely. I'm fine, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at the window. The blinds were closed. She'd closed them when she got home, automatically, without thinking. I'm processing, she said. There's a difference. Fair enough. She heard movement on his end. A door closing, the ambient sound of wherever he was changing slightly, becoming quieter. The patient's stable. He came out of sedation at 1800 hours. He's asking questions. Good questions or bad questions? The kind that tell us he remembers what happened before the crash. A beat. Which is significant. She understood what that meant without needing it explained. If he remembered what happened before the crash, he remembered who had access to his transport route. He remembered the sequence of decisions that had put him on that road. Is he going to make it? She asked. Barring complications. Cross paused. He asked about the nurse, the one in the corridor. Claire didn't say anything. I told him you were staff here. He said, Cross seemed to consider how to phrase the next part. He said the way you moved wasn't civilian. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on Birch Street and its headlights moved across the closed blinds in a long, slow sweep. What did you tell him? She asked. That we were looking into it. Cross's voice was even and careful in the way of someone navigating something they hadn't fully mapped yet. Ms. Dawson, I need to ask you directly. Your record prior to graduate school. There are gaps. People take time off. 14 months with no financial footprint, no address history, no employment record. A pause. That's not time off, that's a redaction. She was quiet for long enough that he didn't feel the silence, which told her he was experienced enough to know when silence was working. I did some work, she said finally, that I'm not able to talk about. For whom? For people who are very particular about that kind of answer. The pause on his end was different this time, more deliberate. All right, he said, then let me ask you something I might be able to get an answer to. He paused. Have you ever heard the operational designation Valkyrie? The word moved through her like cold water finding a crack. Where did you hear that? She said. It came up in the staff sergeant's records, not his current file, an older one. Classified Support Unit, Joint Task Force, Northern Theater. The call sign appears twice in connection with a trauma medic attached to the unit. His voice was careful and precise. The medic's name was redacted, but the physical description is consistent. Claire set down her fork. She hadn't realized she was still holding it. I'd like to continue this conversation in person, Cross said. Tomorrow morning, not at the hospital. Where? He gave her an address, a federal building downtown, 3rd floor, a room number, 8 o'clock. Bring whatever you're comfortable bringing, he said, and whatever you're not. She said she'd be there and hung up and sat at her kitchen table in the apartment on Birch Street that no one at the hospital knew about and was more awake than she'd been in months, which was not entirely an unpleasant feeling and was not entirely a safe one either. She arrived at 7:52. The federal building on Carver Street had the specific institutional gravity of places that processed consequences, not where decisions were made, but where they landed. The lobby was marble and fluorescent light and a security checkpoint that was thorough without being theatrical about it. The agent at the desk had her name on a list. She was escorted to the 3rd floor by someone who introduced himself and then didn't speak again, which she appreciated. The room was a conference room with a window that looked at a concrete wall and a table that had seen better decades. Cross was already there, along with a woman Claire hadn't met. Compact, sharp-featured, with the economical posture of someone who'd learned to take up exactly as much space as the situation required and not a centimeter more. She introduced herself as Agent Lena Bosch, Federal Investigative Division, and shook Claire's hand with the grip of someone who'd stopped performing firmness and just had it. There was also a manila folder on the table that Claire recognized as the kind of folder that contained someone's version of you. Sit down, Cross said. It wasn't unkind. It was just where they were. She sat. Bosch opened the folder but didn't push it across the table yet. We're going to ask you some questions, she said, and I want to be clear that you're not under any obligation to answer them. You're here voluntarily. You're not a subject of this investigation. What is the investigation? Claire asked. The crash on Route 9 is connected to a broader network we've been tracking for 14 months, Bosch said. Individuals with access to military logistics and personnel movement who have been systematically identifying and targeting operators before they can testify in connection with a series of contract fraud investigations. They're killing witnesses, Claire said. They're attempting to. Bosch glanced at Cross. The staff sergeant, whose name we're still not going to share, is the 4th person on a list we recovered in February. The first three didn't make it. She paused, and the pause had weight to it. He's alive because you caught something in a hallway that trained EMS missed in a rig. Claire looked at the table. She knew what was coming, and she knew there was no version of this conversation where she deflected it entirely. The question was how much she gave, and to whom, and whether she could trust that it would be used the way she thought it would be. The designation, she said. Valkyrie. Bosch nodded. It was mine, Claire said. I served as a trauma medic with a classified joint task force for 31 months. The work was specific. High-risk recovery and field surgery in environments where conventional medical support wasn't viable. She kept her voice flat and informational, the way she'd learned to talk about things that were still attached to feelings she managed by not looking at them directly. I left the program under terms that are classified. I completed a nursing degree, took the boards, and came to Redstone Valley. She caught herself. Still wasn't fully used to the new name. And that's the sequence. Why did you leave the program? Bosch asked. Because I was asked to. Bosch and Cross exchanged a look that Claire caught and didn't miss the meaning of. There was a file. Of course there was a file. The question was whether the file had the real reason or the official one, and whether those were the same thing. The terms of your separation, Cross said carefully. They weren't disciplinary. No. Then what were they? She looked at him. They were protective, she said, for me and for the people I worked with. There was a compromise in the unit, not my compromise. But once it happened, the safest thing for the operational integrity of the task force was for the personnel whose identities might be exposed to transition out. She paused. So we did. The room held that for a moment. The compromise, Bosch said. Was it ever resolved? I was told it was. Claire looked at the window and the concrete wall beyond it. I chose to believe that. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of it, Claire had confirmed things she hadn't confirmed to anyone since leaving the program, and had declined to confirm other things, and Bosch had been precise and professional throughout in a way that Claire respected without entirely trusting. Cross had said less than Bosch, but what he'd said had been more considered, and she left with the impression that he was still building a picture she wasn't fully part of yet. They gave her a contact number, different from the one on the card. They told her to continue her normal routine at the hospital. They told her that the patient's security detail had been updated and that there would be a presence at Redstone Valley she might notice and should not acknowledge directly. She drove back to the hospital for her afternoon shift. It was, on its surface, a normal Tuesday. Bay rotations, medication documentation, a teenager with a suspected fracture who turned out to have a suspected fracture confirmed by imaging, a woman in her 70s with confusion that resolved into a UTI that had gone too long without treatment. The ordinary ongoing business of human fragility. Hale was in the department. She saw him twice, once at the station, once in the hallway near radiology. And both times he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not quite the irritated dismissal of the morning before. Something more uncertain, and because she knew him well enough by now to read his moods, the uncertainty made her more alert, not less. He stopped her at 3:40. Dawson. She stopped. Dr. Hale. He had his arms crossed, which was a posture she'd learned meant he was about to say something he'd rehearsed and still wasn't comfortable with. The incident report from yesterday, the corridor decompression. I know about it. I want you to understand that my concern was procedural, not... He paused, with the slight compression of a man revising mid-sentence. Not personal. She waited. The military people, he said. The ones who came to the hospital. What did they want with you? They wanted a statement about the patient's admission, standard procedure for unidentified military personnel. He studied her. He had the look of someone doing math on insufficient information. You know these people? I gave them a statement, Claire said. Is there something you need from me clinically, Dr. Hale? A beat. Then he uncrossed his arms. No, he said, and walked away with the particular stiffness of a man who had wanted to win something and hadn't figured out yet that the game had changed. The presence Cross had mentioned was a man named Sutter. She figured that out by the third day, though he never introduced himself. He was stationed in the hospital's main lobby under the cover of a facilities review, which was convincing enough for most of the staff and completely transparent to her. Mid-30s. Former military, by the way, he oriented himself in doorways, with the slightly too blank expression of someone actively trying to look unremarkable. She made eye contact with him once, by accident, on her way to the vending machine on the second floor, and he looked through her with practiced indifference that she recognized as the real version of the thing she'd been practicing for 2 years. On Thursday morning, the patient was moved to a more secure room in the ICU. Claire wasn't on his care team. That had been deliberately arranged, she understood, to maintain some degree of separation. But she passed his room twice in the course of normal duties, and both times there were 2 people outside who were not hospital staff and were very good at pretending they were. Thursday afternoon was when it started to come apart. She was in the medication room at 2:15 when Petra appeared, and the expression on Petra's face was the specific one that meant something had happened that didn't fit any existing category. "There are 2 men at the main entrance," Petra said. "Security called upstairs. They're asking for patient records on the Route 9 admission. They have paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" "Hospital administrative transfer authorization. But the signatures," Petra lowered her voice. "Johnson in admin says the signatures don't match the department heads they're attributed to. Like, at all." She flagged it. Claire set down the medication she was holding. "Did security call the police?" "They called Hale." Of course they had. Hale was chief of the department. Proper channel. Except Hale didn't know what she knew, which was that the men at the entrance with fraudulent paperwork were not hospital administrators with a filing error. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to the number Bosch had given her. 4 words. 2 men. Main entrance. The response came in 40 seconds. "Don't approach. Stay visible." She stayed visible. She walked to the nurses' station, which had a direct sightline to the elevator bank and a secondary sightline to the stairwell, and she picked up a chart she didn't need and stood there and watched. Hale appeared from his office. She could see him through the glass partition, talking to someone on his phone, then heading toward the elevator. He had the air of a man who had decided to handle something himself, which was exactly the wrong decision, and she had no way to stop him without explaining things she hadn't been cleared to explain. She sent another text. "Department chief heading to lobby." The response? "Sutter is already moving. Hold, hold." She held. Sutter intercepted Hale before he reached the elevator. She could see it happening from the station, the 2 of them pausing in the corridor while Sutter said something that made Hale go very still and then nod once and step back. Sutter was on his radio. Whatever he said into it moved fast because less than 3 minutes later, 2 more people appeared from the parking structure entrance and moved through the lobby in the direction of the main doors with the specific, unhurried speed of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they were going to do when they got there. The men with the fraudulent paperwork were detained. It took less time than she expected, and it was quiet enough that the waiting room didn't understand what had happened. The desk staff looked shaken. The security guard nearest the door had the expression of someone who'd watched something move faster than he'd been ready for. Hale came back upstairs 20 minutes later and found Claire still at the nurse's station. He stopped beside her. His face was doing something she'd never seen it do before, which was struggle. "Those men," he said. He kept his voice low. "They were asking for the Route 9 patient's records." "I know." "The federal agent in the lobby." He stopped, started again. "What is happening in my hospital?" She looked at him directly. It was the first time in 2 years and 4 months that she'd looked at him and felt something other than the low-grade management of his dismissal. What she felt now was something closer to pity, which was not kind, but was honest. "A man is alive upstairs who shouldn't be," she said. "Some people want to change that. The people who are trying to stop them are here, and they're good at their jobs." She paused. "Let them do those jobs." Hale opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between the version of himself he'd been 48 hours ago and a version he hadn't decided on yet. "You knew," he said. "When those investigators came, you already knew." "Not everything," she said. "Enough." He walked away without another word, and she turned back to the chart she wasn't reading, and her pulse was elevated by maybe 6 beats per minute, which was manageable. Cross came to the hospital that evening. Not to the consultation room this time, to a small office near the administrative wing that had been offered to him by someone with more authority than Hale, and that had been quietly converted into something more functional than its original purpose. There was a laptop and a secure phone and two agents Claire hadn't met before, and Bosch was on a video call from somewhere that looked like a field office. "The men from the lobby," Cross said. "They're connected to the network we briefed you on. Lower tier, but the authorization chain they were using traces back to someone with institutional access." "Institutional," Claire said. "Military contracting. Someone with the clearance to spoof medical transfer paperwork and make it look official." Bosch's voice from the laptop had the slightly compressed quality of a secure connection. "The network isn't just targeting operators, Dawson. They've been mapping the hospitals these people get transported to. Redstone Valley was on a list." Claire absorbed that. "So this wasn't random," she said. "The crash on Route 9, routing him here, wasn't random." "No," Bosch said. "It wasn't." She sat with that for a moment. The hospital had a list of trauma centers in a 100-mile radius. Redstone Valley was the closest Level 2 facility to the Route 9 corridor. If you wanted to route a military casualty here, you just needed to influence the dispatch recommendation. And if you had institutional access, you think someone inside the system flagged this hospital as the destination, she said. "We think someone inside the system knew that if the crash didn't kill him, getting to him afterward would be easier here than at a major Level 1 center with better security infrastructure." Cross leaned forward, "which means they also knew about the security gaps here, the staffing levels, the response protocols. Which means someone did their homework. Extensively." He paused. "Which is why we need to move him. Tonight." Claire looked up. "Tonight." There's a window between the evening shift change and the overnight staff rotation where a secure transport can move without drawing attention. We have a facility 60 miles north that's better equipped for his protection. Cross looked at her carefully. "I'd like you to accompany the transport." The room was very quiet. "I'm a floor nurse," she said. "You have military medics." "I have military medics who don't know this patient's clinical history as of 72 hours ago," Cross said. "And I have a transport window that's 4 hours away." He held her gaze. "You caught what everyone else missed, twice." She looked at the laptop screen where Bosch was watching her with the expression of someone who'd already made her own calculation. "This isn't a request," Bosch said. "Not unkindly. But it's not an order either. You have a choice here." Claire thought about the card on her kitchen table, the 2 words on the back. She thought about a man in a room upstairs who was alive because she'd been standing in the right corridor at the right moment, watching his face instead of the monitor. She thought about 31 months of work she couldn't talk about and hadn't talked about, and the strange, specific weight of silence around a thing you were still, in ways you didn't fully examine, defined by. "What time?" she said. 2200, Cross said. She looked at the clock on the wall. That was 4 hours and 12 minutes away. "I need to finish my shift," she said. "I know." He almost smiled again, still not quite there. "We'll be ready." She stood up, and as she moved toward the door, one of the agents she didn't know shifted slightly to let her pass, and she was in the hallway again, in the ordinary fluorescent-lit corridor of Redstone Valley Medical Center, with the smell of disinfectant and the distant intercom and the sound of monitors doing their patient, metronomic work. When her phone buzzed. Unknown number, not the ones Bosch or Cross had given her. She stopped walking. The text was 3 words. "We see you." She stood very still in the hallway, phone in hand, and looked at the text, and then she looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner junction of the ceiling 20 feet away. The one she knew had a 40-degree blind spot on its left side because she'd noticed it 8 months ago and had never mentioned it to anyone. And in the blind spot, at the far end of the corridor, near the stairwell door, stood a man she had never seen before in clothes that looked enough like maintenance staff that no one would have looked twice. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. She didn't run. Running was the wrong move when someone wanted you to know they were watching, because running confirmed that you understood the message, and understanding the message meant you were a variable they needed to manage immediately. Standing still bought time. Standing still looked like confusion, and confusion was not a threat, so she stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to look like someone who had received an unexpected text from an unknown number and was deciding whether it was a wrong number. And then she put her phone in her scrubs pocket and walked, at the pace of someone with a destination but not an emergency, toward the nurse's station at the end of the hall. She did not look at the man near the stairwell again. She did not look at the camera. At the nurse's station, she picked up a chart. The same gestural move she'd made 2 days ago, which now felt like a different person's habit, and kept the stairwell door in her peripheral vision and counted. In her experience, which was specific and not transferable to most nursing situations, a surveillance contact who had just revealed himself had roughly 90 seconds before he either moved or was replaced by someone else. Revealing himself had been a choice. The question was what the choice was meant to accomplish. Intimidation. Most likely. We know where you are. We know you're involved. Stand down. The alternative, that it was something more operational than a message, was possible but less efficient. If they'd wanted to move on her directly, the corridor had been emptier 30 seconds ago. She texted Cross. Surveillance contact, stairwell B, 3rd floor. Unknown male, maintenance cover, still on floor. The response came in 22 seconds. Don't engage. Sutter is moving. Get to the admin wing. She set down the chart, told the nurse beside her she needed to check something in supply, and walked toward the administrative corridor at a pace that cost her something, because every instinct she had that she'd spent 2 years pretending she didn't have was pushing her faster than was smart. She made it to the admin wing. Sutter appeared from a side door 30 seconds later with the compressed, directed energy of someone who'd been running and had stopped just before turning a corner. He's gone, Sutter said. Use the stairwell. We have someone on the ground floor. He wasn't there to move on me, Claire said. He was there to be seen. Sutter looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly. How sure are you? The positioning was wrong for an intercept. He wanted me to see him and know what it meant. She paused. Which means they know more about my involvement than they should. Sutter's jaw tightened. He pulled his radio. She heard him report the contact in clipped, specific language that confirmed he was better at this than his facility's cover had suggested. Cross arrived 7 minutes later, and the expression on his face when he came through the admin wing door was the one she'd learned to read as controlled alarm, the version of concern that people with his training wore when something had moved faster than the plan. They made contact, he said. A message. They know I'm connected to the patient, and they want me to know they know. Which means the transport window is compromised, he said it flatly. If they're tracking your involvement, they're watching your movements. Moving him tonight with you in the vehicle paints a direct line. Then don't move him tonight, she said. Leaving him here another 12 hours isn't… I know. She cut him off, not rudely, just efficiently. But a compromised transport is worse than a delayed one. If they're watching me, they're watching the loading dock. They're watching the ambulance bay. She looked at him. You know this. Cross looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Sutter. Then he made a decision she could see him making, which was the decision to accept that the person in front of him knew something he needed to use. 12 hours, he said. We adjust the window. I need to make calls. While you do that, Claire said, I need to finish my shift, because if I disappear from the floor for the rest of the evening, whoever's watching will know something changed. Cross nodded once. Sutter stays on your floor. Fine. She turned back toward the corridor. Tell him to stay out of my way when I'm with patients. She finished the shift. She did it the way she'd done every shift for 2 years and 4 months, methodically, without shortcuts, with the particular quality of attention she gave to work that mattered to her regardless of anything else happening around it. A post-op hip replacement patient needed her pain management reassessed. A child in Bay 4 had a fever that had come down enough to discharge, but whose mother needed 20 minutes of careful, unhurried explanation before she felt confident going home. The documentation backlog from the afternoon's disruption needed to be cleared before handoff. She did all of it. Sutter maintained a loose perimeter she was aware of and ignored. Nobody contacted her on either of the numbers she'd been given. The stairwell near Bay 3 remained quiet. When she clocked out at 7:40, 3 things were true. She was tired in the specific bone-level way of a long shift compounded by sustained alertness. The transport plan had been revised to a window at 0400 the following morning, and somewhere in or near Redstone Valley Medical Center, someone was watching her and had decided she needed to know it. She drove home on a different route than usual, not dramatically different. She wasn't trying to lose a tail, because if one was there, she didn't have the resources to lose it cleanly, and attempting it would confirm she was trying. She just varied the route the way a mildly cautious person varied a route, which gave her an extra 4 minutes and a view of the Birch Street corner from the north before she turned onto it. Nothing obvious. She parked, went upstairs, checked the deadbolt. Still intact, the small piece of tape she'd placed at the lower hinge still in position, and sat at the kitchen table and tried to eat something and managed about half of it before she gave up and just sat with the lights low and let her brain do what it needed to do. The question she kept coming back to was the text. "We see you." Not stop or back off or any version of a direct instruction. Just, "We see you." Which could mean several things, and the thing it most likely meant was that they were uncertain about her. They knew she was connected to the patient. They didn't know how much she knew or how much she'd told the investigators. So instead of moving against her directly, which created exposure and noise, they'd sent a message designed to make her make a decision that would tell them what they needed to know. If she panicked, she confirmed she understood the stakes. If she ran, she confirmed she was a liability. If she did nothing, if she went home and slept and showed up for her shift the following day like a nurse who'd received a wrong number text, she became an ambiguous variable again. Harder to act on, harder to categorize. She was going to do nothing, or rather, she was going to do everything she was already doing at the same pace with the same visible routine, and she was going to let Cross and Bosch do the work they were equipped to do, and she was going to be at the hospital at 03:30 because that's what she'd agreed to. She set an alarm for 2:45 and went to sleep, which was a thing she'd trained herself to do under worse conditions, and which took about 11 minutes. The 0400 transport did not go as planned. It didn't go catastrophically wrong, which was the thing she held on to afterward when she was reassembling the sequence. But it did not go as planned. The ambulance bay at Redstone Valley at 0340 was quiet in the way of a hospital's quietest hour. The overnight staff stretched thin across the floor, the ambient noise of the building reduced to its mechanical baseline, the parking structure mostly empty. Cross had 2 vehicles staged, the transport ambulance and a follow vehicle, and a team of 4 she hadn't met before who moved with the tight economy of people who did this regularly. The patient had been assessed at OH300 and cleared for transport. His pressure was stable. His output was acceptable. He was conscious, which was better than optimal from a security standpoint because conscious patients had opinions, but he was also cooperative and had been briefed on what was happening. She'd met him properly for the first time at 0315 in the dim of his ICU room with the monitors turned low and 2 agents outside the door. His name, Cross had finally told her, was Marcus Teller. He was 34. He had the quality of stillness that came from pain being managed rather than absent, and eyes that were tracking everything in the room with a precision that the sedation had not fully touched. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm one of them. The one from the corridor." It wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. He had the slightly raw expression of someone who'd done the math on how close things had been and had not yet decided how he felt about the answer. "Cross says you caught a full arrest that the monitors missed." The sensor slipped. "He says you were watching my face." It was the right thing to watch. Teller was quiet for a moment. "I was in a 6-man unit for 4 years, he said. "I've had medics save my life twice. You move like them." She checked his IV line and didn't answer, and he let it go with the easy pragmatism of someone who'd learned which questions to ask and which ones to park. The transport loaded without incident. She rode in the back of the ambulance with Teller and a military medic named Reyes, late 20s, competent, appropriately deferential, once he'd watched her assess Teller's vitals in the first 90 seconds. The follow vehicle was behind them. Cross was in the follow vehicle. They were 14 minutes out of Harlan Falls when Reyes said, "Vehicle behind the follow car." She looked at the monitor. Teller looked at her. "How long?" she asked. "Since we turned onto Route 12, maybe before." Reyes had a radio in his hand. "I'm going to call it in. Do it quietly." He did. Cross's voice came back low and controlled. "We see it. Maintaining speed. Do not change pace." She watched Teller's pressure on the monitor. Stress response was pushing it up. Not dramatically, but measurably. His body was doing the math, even if he was keeping his face still. "You need to stay level," she said to him quietly. "I know what I need," he said. Not hostile, just honest. "Good." The vehicle behind the follow car maintained its distance for 4 minutes. Then it accelerated. Cross's voice on the radio went sharp. "They're moving. Brace for evasive." What followed was 3 minutes and 40 seconds that she reconstructed afterward from memory because there was no clean way to experience it in real time. The ambulance accelerated. She braced against the cabinet rack with one hand and kept the other on Teller's IV line, because a displaced IV in an accelerating vehicle was a solvable problem, and a crash without a line was not. Reyes grabbed the overhead rail and called a secondary contact to Cross. The vehicles behind them, there were two now, not one, which meant the second had been staged ahead and had entered from a side road, were running without lights, which told her everything she needed to know about what this was. Teller's pressure spiked to 160 over 94. Not dangerous, but not good. The ambulance took a turn hard enough that something in the cabinet shifted and hit the floor, and she was repositioning before the vehicle straightened, moving Teller's monitor stand back into contact range, checking the line, checking his face. "Still with me?" she said. "Unfortunately," he said, which was, under the circumstances, the correct answer. Then Cross's voice. "Federal intercept. Stand by." And then the vehicles behind them were no longer an immediate problem, because something had moved in from the road ahead, not blocking, flanking, and there were lights now and a kind of controlled convergence that she recognized as a pre-positioned operation, which meant Bosch had known this was a possibility and had staged for it without telling them, which was either very smart or the kind of thing you did when you weren't entirely sure who you could tell. The ambulance stopped. She sat in the back with her hand on Teller's arm, monitoring his radial pulse because the monitor had briefly lost adhesion in the hard turn, and listened to controlled movement outside and voices she couldn't fully make out. And Teller looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing the same math she was doing. "We're okay," she said. She said it because the clinical reality supported it, not because she was certain of everything outside the vehicle. "Are we?" he said. "Your pressure's coming down. Line's intact. We're stationary." He almost smiled. "That's a very specific definition of okay. It's the one I can verify." The back doors opened and Cross was there, looking like someone who'd just run a quarter-mile and was not going to acknowledge it. "Both vehicles are stopped. We have personnel on scene. We're going to hold here for 12 minutes while the road gets cleared ahead." "The drivers?" Claire asked. "Detained." He looked at Teller. "How are you doing?" "Ask her," Teller said. "She's got better data." They reached the northern facility at 0620. It was a converted medical wing attached to a federal installation, not a hospital exactly, but equipped well enough that she did a full reassessment of Teller on arrival and found his vitals had stabilized back to acceptable ranges. Reyes was good with the handoff. The receiving team was efficient. There was coffee, which she drank standing up in a hallway outside the intake room while the adrenaline metabolized at its own pace and couldn't be hurried. Bosch arrived at 0650 by a different route. She looked like someone who hadn't slept either, and who was functioning anyway with the slightly abraded composure of someone managing a great deal of information at once. "The vehicles," Claire said. "Both drivers are talking. Low-tier hired contractors, not core network." Bosch had a tablet and was scrolling as she spoke. "But the authorization for the intercept, who knew the transport window, who knew the route, that's a smaller circle." "How small?" Bosch looked up. "Small enough that it's someone with access to what we shared internally in the past 48 hours. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the facility, a door closed. "You're saying there's a leak inside the investigation," Claire said. "I'm saying we have a problem we haven't fully located yet." Bosch's voice was even. "And I'm saying that you and the patient are currently the two people in this situation I'm most confident about, which is either reassuring or a significant commentary on how bad the rest of it is." Claire drank her coffee. It was bad coffee. Institutional, made hours ago and kept warm in the way that made it worse rather than better. But it was hot, and she drank it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to go back to Redstone Valley today," Bosch said. "Your shift is at noon. You go in. You work your shift. You behave exactly as you would behave if last night was something that happened to someone else." She paused. "Because whoever sent that text last night is going to be watching to see what you do next. And what you do next is nothing. And if they make contact again, you call me before you respond." Bosch looked at her steadily. "Can you do that?" The question was about more than logistics, and they both knew it. It was about whether Claire could walk back into a building where someone had looked at her from across a corridor and wanted her to feel the weight of it, and work a 12-hour shift as though the weight wasn't there. She'd done it before. She'd done it under conditions that made this look administrative. Yes, she said. She slept for 3 hours in a spare room at the facility, which was more than she'd expected to manage, and drove back to Harlan Falls in the gray early morning light with the kind of clarity that came after a night like that. Not calm, exactly, but simplified, reduced to the immediate and the necessary. She stopped for better coffee on the way. She texted her sister back about Thanksgiving. She did these things deliberately, not because they mattered enormously, but because the practice of returning to ordinary things was its own kind of discipline. And she'd learned that years ago in a context she wasn't going to think about on Route 12 at 7:40 in the morning. She was home by 8:15, showered, changed, ate something that wasn't coffee. Checked the deadbolt tape, still intact. She arrived at Redstone Valley at 11:45. The morning shift was handing off to afternoons, the board was full, and the ER had the midday tempo of a department that had been busy and was about to be busier. Petra was at the station looking tired in the professional way she always looked tired, which was to say that she was fully functional and deeply over it. "You look terrible," Petra said. "Rough night," Claire said. Petra handed her the afternoon board. "Hale wants to see you before rounds." Claire looked at the board. "What for?" "He didn't say." Petra paused. "He's been in his office since 8, which is weird because he's never in this early on a Thursday." It was a Thursday. She'd lost track of days. She took the board and went to find Hale, because the fastest way through something was usually directly. I was at his desk when she knocked, and he looked up with the expression of someone who had been sitting with a decision for several hours and had not fully arrived at it yet. He gestured at the chair across from him, and she sat. "The federal agents," he said. "They briefed me this morning." She waited. "Not everything," he clarified, "but enough." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the specific way of someone examining something they'd built and were reconsidering its structural integrity. "There was a security incident last night, on the 3rd floor, and he paused, "a transport situation that I was told about in terms that were very deliberately vague." "Okay." He looked at her. "You were involved." "I assisted with a patient transport." "Claire." He said her first name, which he had not done in 2 years and 4 months. It landed oddly. "I have been told, by people with considerably more federal clearance than I have, that you have a background that makes you qualified to do things I was not aware any of my nursing staff could do." He paused. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. The apology was sitting in the room between them with all the awkwardness of something that had been overdue for so long that it had accumulated weight. She could see him trying to carry it, and she could see it was harder than he'd expected. He stopped. "I've been dismissive, in ways that were unprofessional. I made assumptions about your competence based on—" He stopped again. "Based on what?" she said. Not unkindly, but she wanted him to finish the sentence. He met her eyes. "Based on the fact that you didn't push back." She let that sit for a moment. It was honest, which she respected more than a polished version would have been. "I didn't push back," she said, "because the work was more important than the argument." Hale nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else. And then his desk phone rang, and he looked at the number, and something in his face changed. Not alarm exactly, but the specific sharpness of someone receiving unexpected information. And he picked it up. She watched him listen, watched the color shift slightly in his face, watched his hand tighten on the receiver. He hung up and looked at her. "There's a man," he said slowly, "in the hospital, not a patient. He came through the visitor entrance 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Security is trying to locate him now. They're saying he accessed the record system from a terminal on the 2nd floor before they flagged him." Claire was already calculating. "What records?" she said. "Staff records," Hale said. "Personnel files." His voice was very careful. He pulled 2 files before the system logged the unauthorized access. She kept her face still. "Whose?" she said. Hale looked at her across the desk. "Yours," he said, "and mine." She was out of the chair before Hale finished the sentence. Not running, moving, which was different, which was purposeful, and fast without the visibility of panic. She pulled her phone as she came through his office door and had Cross's number dialed before she hit the hallway. He picked up on the first ring. "Someone accessed personnel files at Redstone Valley," she said. "Mine and Hale's. Terminal on the second floor 20 minutes ago. Security is looking for him, but they won't find him." A beat. "How sure are you?" He had 20 minutes and a specific target list. "He's already out." She was moving toward the stairwell. "What's on my personnel file that they'd want?" "Your address," Cross said. "Your emergency contacts. Your schedule." She stopped walking. Emergency contacts. Her sister. Rachel, who lived in Missoula with her husband and their 7-year-old, who texted about Thanksgiving plans and didn't know anything about any of this. "I need you to make a call," Claire said. "Already on it." His voice was ahead of her, which meant he'd already been thinking about the same thing. "We have someone in Missoula. She'll be contacted in the next 10 minutes. The relief was there, and then she put it somewhere else because she couldn't afford it right now. "They pulled Hale's file too," she said. "Why Hale?" "That's the right question." Cross paused, and she heard the sound of him moving, a door, voices in the background. "Stay in the hospital. Visible. I'm 20 minutes out." She hung up and stood in the stairwell for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to recalibrate, not long enough to be missed, and then pushed back through the door and went to find Sutter. He was on the second floor near radiology, which meant he'd already heard. His expression confirmed it. "The terminal," she said quietly, "wiped clean. Whoever used it knew where the logging gaps were." He kept his voice below the ambient noise of the corridor, which means they had the hospital's network layout. "Or someone gave it to them." Sutter looked at her. "Yeah." She thought about Hale's file. She thought about what was in a chief surgeon's personnel record that was worth pulling alongside hers, schedule certainly, administrative access codes possibly, and the specific category of information that lived in HR files that most people forgot was there. Security clearance documentation for staff with elevated system access. Hale had elevated system access. He was department chief. He could authorize emergency protocol changes, override triage assignments, modify patient placement records. She walked back to his office. He was standing at his window when she came in, looking at the parking structure, and he turned when she entered with the expression of a man who'd been sitting with something uncomfortable and was ready to stop sitting with it. "Your system access," she said. "Your department chief codes. Have you used them in the past 72 hours for anything outside your normal routine?" He frowned. "I authorized a bed transfer on Tuesday. A protocol update for—" "On whose request?" "Administration sent a memo. Routine update to the ICU placement." He stopped. His face did something complicated. "The ICU placement protocol. For which rooms?" He was already moving to his computer. She came around the desk and stood beside him because there wasn't time for him to summarize it, and she needed to see it directly. He pulled up the memo, dated Tuesday, sent from a generic administration account, requesting he authorize a modification to ICU bed rotation that would have moved a specific category of patient, unidentified, security flagged, to a room on the East Corridor. The East Corridor had one exit that wasn't covered by the updated security camera system Sutter had arranged. She knew that because she'd walked that corridor a dozen times and noticed the gap the same way she noticed all gaps, automatically, the way she'd been trained to notice them. "Did you authorize it?" she said. He looked at the screen. "I signed the approval. It was a standard—" "Who sent this memo?" He looked at the sender address. It was an internal hospital account. Administration, generic. "Pull the account," she said. "Find out who created it." He called a T. She stood beside him and listened to the conversation, and by the time he hung up, they both knew. The account had been created 11 days ago by someone using a contractor access credential that had been issued for a network maintenance project 3 weeks prior. The contractor had completed the work and left. The credential had not been deactivated. "They've been inside the system for 11 days, she said. Hale's face had gone through several things and had arrived somewhere she recognized. Not the particular arrogance of a man who believed he was the most qualified person in any room, but something underneath it. The actual person who lived under that, who was looking at evidence that he'd been used as an instrument in something he hadn't understood, and was handling the reality of it badly, but honestly. "I authorized a room placement that—" He stopped. "That would have moved Teller to an unmonitored corridor." She kept her voice level. You didn't know what you were signing. That doesn't… I know. She looked at him. It doesn't make it not your signature, but you didn't know. He sat down. It was the kind of sitting down that happened when the physical and the psychological aligned. When someone's body understood something at the same time their mind did and both of them needed a moment. She left him there and went to find Cross. Cross arrived at 11 minutes, not 20, which meant he'd been closer than he'd said, or he'd driven faster than he should have, and she didn't ask which. He came through the admin entrance with Bosch and two people she hadn't seen before. A man and a woman, both carrying the specific kind of efficiency that meant federal and not local. And they converged in the administrative conference room that had become, over the past 3 days, something like a field office. She laid it out in 4 minutes. The memo, the contractor credential, the room placement authorization, the personnel file access. Cross listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. Bosch took notes on a tablet. When Claire finished, Bosch said, "The contractor credential, we can trace that." "It is pulling the access logs now," Claire said, "but whoever used it knew to use a maintenance window. The log gaps will be consistent with legitimate service activity." "They'll still leave something," Bosch said. "They always do." "How long?" Cross asked. "Hours. Maybe less if the logs are clean." Bosch was already typing. "But that's not our immediate problem." "What's the immediate problem?" Claire asked. Bosch looked up. "The immediate problem is that they pulled your address from that personnel file. The new one. Not the old Birch Street address in the system. You said you updated it 8 months ago." She had. She'd been thorough about it, which meant the file had her current address. "My team in Missoula has your sister," Cross said. "She's secure. But your apartment is already compromised," Claire said. "I know. We're not suggesting you go there. I wasn't planning to." She looked at him. "What I'm planning is to finish my shift because I told Bosch I would, and because leaving early creates a visible change in my routine that confirms to whoever is watching that something has shifted." Cross and Bosch exchanged a look that contained a conversation. "There's another reason to stay," Bosch said carefully. "We've been tracking the authorization chain for the room placement memo. The contractor credential traces back through 3 layers of access, and the 3rd layer," she paused, "connects to an internal source, someone who works in this hospital." The room was quiet. "You have a name?" Claire said. "We have a pattern," Bosch said. "Access times, terminal locations, a behavioral signature in the log data that's consistent across 11 days. She set the tablet down. "It's not a doctor or a nurse. It's someone in administrative services who has been providing system access and patient location data. To the network. To someone inside the network. A coordinator. Someone managing the hospital-side logistics of the operation." Bosch looked at her steadily. "They're still in the building. Asen." The name, when it came, was Martin Goff. Mid-level administrative coordinator, 11 years at Redstone Valley, the kind of institutional presence that accumulated access and invisibility in roughly equal measure. He managed bed allocation records, had standard administrative system clearance, and had, over the past 4 months, accessed patient placement data at hours inconsistent with his scheduled shifts approximately 37 times. She didn't know him well. She knew his face, 50s, heavy-set, always seemed to be carrying something when he walked through the ER corridor, a folder or a clipboard or a coffee cup, the universal props of someone who wanted to look occupied. She'd never had a conversation with him that lasted more than 30 seconds and had never had a reason to think about him more than that. Bosch laid out the access pattern on the conference table screen, and Cross's 2 new agents studied it with the focus of people doing rapid verification, and it held together the way things held together when they were true rather than constructed, imperfectly, with the gaps and inconsistencies of real behavior rather than the clean logic of fabricated evidence. "We bring him in now," Cross said, "and we lose the coordinator above him. He'll go silent the moment he knows Goff is in custody." "So we wait," Claire said. "We wait for the coordinator to make contact, which they will." Bosch checked her watch. "Because they know the transport last night failed. They know the personnel files were pulled this morning. They're going to want a status update from Goff." "And when they contact him," Claire said, "you trace it." "If Goff uses hospital systems to respond, yes." Bosch looked at her. "Which is where you're useful." She understood. You need someone on the floor who can see if Goff accesses a terminal and alert you before the session closes. Sutter can do that, Cross said. Sutter doesn't know which terminals Goff uses, which corridors he takes, or what his normal movement pattern looks like, Claire said. I've worked in this building for 2 years, I do. Cross looked like he wanted to argue and didn't have the material for it. Keep your distance, Bosch said. You're not surveillance. You're an extra set of eyes who knows the building. I know, Claire said. I'll stay out of it. She didn't entirely stay out of it, but she stayed out of it enough. The contact came at 2:40 in the afternoon. She was at the nurse's station on the second floor, legitimately, charting, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, when she saw Goff come through the corridor with his standard clipboard and take the turn toward the administrative terminal alcove near the elevator bank. He used those terminals. She'd seen him there before and had categorized it as unremarkable, the way everything about him was designed to be unremarkable. She texted Sutter a single character, G. He was on it before Goff had logged in. She kept charting. She did not look at the alcove. She listened to the ambient noise of the floor and timed it. A terminal session for a brief status communication would take 3 to 5 minutes. And at the 4-minute mark, she heard the subtle shift of movement from that direction and glanced up naturally, the way anyone might glance up, and saw Goff heading back toward the main corridor with his clipboard and his practiced air of being occupied. She texted Sutter again. Done. Heading south corridor. The response came 30 seconds later. Got it. Tracing now. The trace took 19 minutes. She spent them charting and redirecting a second-year resident who was about to make a medication error that wasn't dangerous but was going to cause paperwork, and assessing a patient in Bay 2 who needed his wound dressing changed, and doing the ordinary work of the floor, because the ordinary work of the floor was what she was there to do. When Bosch's message came through, it was 6 words. Coordinator identified. Federal arrest in progress. She read it once, set her phone face down on the counter, and finished the wound dressing. The coordinator was a retired logistics officer named Dale Pruitt, who had spent 12 years building contracts between military transport services and civilian medical facilities, and who had used that access to identify and route targets for the network. He was arrested at his home office in Billings at 3:17 in the afternoon, while on a call he believed was with Goff, which was not with Goff, because Goff by that point was sitting in a federal vehicle in the Redstone Valley parking structure, explaining everything he knew as quickly as he could, in the hope that the speed of his explanation would be counted in his favor. Cross told her this in the conference room at 4 o'clock. She was eating a granola bar she'd found in her locker that was probably from last month, and she listened to the summary without interrupting, and when he was done, she asked the question she needed the answer to. Tell her, she said. Is he still secure? Yes, the facility has been notified and security has been updated. Cross paused. Pruitt's network had 4 other active targets. All 4 are now being relocated. And the people who sent the text last night? The man in the corridor? 2 in custody. 1 still unaccounted for. He held her gaze. We're looking. She nodded and ate the rest of the granola bar because her body needed something, and it was what was available. The leak, she said. In the investigation. You said there was a problem you hadn't fully located. Cross was quiet for a moment. Pruitt had a source inside the task force coordinating the investigation, not a federal agent, a contracted analyst who had access to operational schedules. He paused. She's been suspended pending investigation. She? Yes. She thought about the transport window, about who had known, about the 40 seconds of response time when she'd texted Bosch from the corridor, and whether that gap had been processing time or something else. Bosch knew about the leak before she told me, Claire said. It wasn't a question. She suspected, Cross said carefully. She was trying to verify without tipping the source. By not telling me everything. By not telling anyone everything. He met her eyes, including me. The honesty of it was something she respected, even though it also meant that she'd been operating for the past 24 hours with incomplete information in a situation where incomplete information had direct physical consequences. She turned that over, looked at it, and set it down. It was the right call, operationally. She would have made the same one. Hale, she said. What happens to him? Nothing criminal. He was used, not complicit. The authorization he signed will be part of the evidentiary record, but his cooperation and the clear absence of intent. Cross paused. He's not in legal jeopardy. That's not what I was asking. Cross looked at her. He's been running this department on the assumption that his authority is self-validating, she said. That if he believes something is correct, the believing makes it so. She folded the granola bar wrapper with the precise movements of someone who needed to do something with their hands. He authorized a document he didn't investigate because it came through the right channel and had the right letterhead. He dismissed a staff member for 2 years because she didn't perform the kind of resistance he would have recognized as competence. Cross was quiet. He's not a bad person, she said, but he's been a bad chief. That's a hospital matter. I know. She stood up. I still have 3 hours left on my shift. She worked them. It was not easy and it was not graceful, and by the last hour she was running on the specific tired that lived below the manageable tired, the one that made small decisions require more processing than they should. But she worked them because the patients on the floor didn't know or care what the past 4 days had contained, and because the practice of showing up when it was hard was the practice, not the exception. At 6:45, with 15 minutes left, Hale found her in the medication room. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, which was not something he usually did. He was a man who entered rooms with certainty, even when the certainty was performed. The federal agents briefed me more fully this afternoon, he said. She finished what she was doing and turned to face him. The memo I authorized. He stopped. His jaw was tight in the way of someone who had been sitting with something for hours and was still not comfortable with its weight. If you hadn't flagged the ICU room assignment on Tuesday, I didn't flag it. The investigators were already looking at the access patterns. But you identified the camera gap on the east corridor. He met her eyes. Cross told me. He said you noted it as a security concern when you were reviewing the transport route. She had. She'd mentioned it to Sutter in passing, the same way she'd noted a dozen other things about the building's layout since the investigation had involved her. The same way she always noted things about spaces she worked in. She hadn't thought of it as a significant contribution. She'd thought of it as information that was there and should be shared. It was relevant, she said. It was the reason they caught the room placement as an attempt rather than a coincidence, Hale said. Without that, he stopped again. I was clearly having a hard time with this conversation, and she let him have it without helping him, because some things needed to be worked through rather than assisted. I've been building a case for the Department Review Board to have you formally written up for the corridor decompression, he said. Unauthorized procedure, protocol deviation. She waited. I'm withdrawing it, he said. Okay. That's all you're going to say? She looked at him. What would you like me to say? He held her gaze for a moment, and in the quality of his silence, she could see him reckoning with the fact that there was no version of her response that would make him feel better about what he'd been doing for the past 2 years, and that the absence of her anger was more uncomfortable than her anger would have been. I'm going to recommend a formal review of nursing staff evaluations going back 18 months, he said. The department has some corrective work to do. That's a good idea, she said. I'll need your input. I know the floor, she said. I'll help. He nodded once and left, and she finished the medication documentation and clocked out at 7:02 and sat in her car in the parking structure for a few minutes before she drove away, not because she was avoiding anything, but because she needed a moment of stillness that wasn't performed and wasn't observed. It was dark outside. The parking structure was mostly empty. A light on the 3rd level flickered the way it had been flickering for 6 weeks, which meant someone had finally put in the maintenance request, and it still hadn't been addressed. And she thought about putting it in herself and then thought about the fact that she didn't have an apartment to go to and would be staying at the address Cross had arranged, a federal safe house on the north edge of Harlan Falls, until the 3rd member of the surveillance team was accounted for. She pulled out her phone. There was a message from her sister, sent 2 hours ago. The people who came to the house were very polite. Are you okay? Call me when you can. She typed back, I'm okay. I'll explain when I can. I love you. Then she put the phone on the passenger seat and sat in the quiet of the parking structure with the flickering light 3 levels up, and thought about what Cross had told her that morning at the federal facility. That Prewitt's network had been operating for 14 months, that 4 other people were being relocated, that a contracted analyst had been feeding operational intelligence to the wrong side for reasons that were probably financial and were definitely going to be expensive. She thought about Teller in a secure room 60 miles north, with his stubborn pulse and his dry humor and his eyes that tracked everything. She thought about the man who was still unaccounted for, and then her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. Not unknown, not blocked, but an actual number she simply hadn't seen before. And she looked at it for one full ring before she answered, because she already knew, in the part of her that had been operating at a frequency she couldn't turn off, that the call was not from someone on her side. "Miss Dawson," said a voice she had never heard before. Male, measured, with the cadence of someone accustomed to being the calmest person in any conversation. "I think it's time we spoke directly." She kept her own voice flat and unhurried. "You're the one who's still unaccounted for," she said. A pause. Then, with something that might have been appreciation, "I heard you were perceptive. What do you want?" "A conversation," he said. "A real one, without major cross-listening." Another pause, and in it she heard something that was almost certainly ambient sound, outdoor, moving, which meant he was not stationary. "I have information about why you were really separated from the task force, Miss Dawson, about what actually happened during the compromise." His voice was even and careful. "About who authorized it." The parking structure was very quiet. The flickering light on the third level pulsed once, steadied, pulsed again. "I'm listening," she said, and her voice gave nothing away, and her free hand, resting on her knee in the dark of the car, was completely, absolutely still. She did not say anything else right away. The silence she offered him was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of someone making a rapid series of decisions and disguising the process as patience. She needed 30 seconds, maybe less, long enough to register that the call was coming from outside, that he was moving, that he'd chosen to contact her directly rather than through any intermediary, which meant either the intermediaries were gone or he'd decided they were a liability. She needed to alert Cross without ending the call or alerting the man on the other end. Her thumb found the side button on her phone by muscle memory. 3 quick presses, the emergency SOS function, which she'd checked and confirmed 2 days ago out of a habit she'd maintained since leaving the program. It sent a location ping and a distress flag to a pre-registered number. She'd added Cross's number to that registry the morning after their first meeting, quietly, at the kitchen table, because she was someone who thought about contingencies the way other people thought about grocery lists. "You said you have information about the compromise," she said. "I said I have information about what actually happened." His voice was patient and carried no urgency, which was itself informative. Men who were running ran differently than men who believed they had leverage. "There's a distinction." "I'm listening," she said again. "The task force compromise in the Northern Theater, the one that ended your service, wasn't a breach from outside." A pause, deliberate and measured. It was manufactured from inside, specifically by someone who needed a reason to rotate personnel out of a unit that had started asking questions about contract irregularities that predated the Prewitt network by 4 years. She kept her breathing even. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Prewitt is in custody and Goff is talking, and the people who built this network are already calculating who they can put in front of a prosecutor to reduce their own exposure." His voice shifted by a fraction. Not threatening, but more direct. "I was an analyst. I built models. I told people what they wanted to hear about targeting windows and transport vulnerabilities, and I told myself the distinction mattered." Another pause. "It stopped mattering some time ago." "You want to cooperate," she said. "I want to have a conversation with someone who isn't already inside the federal investigation's decision chain. Someone who has a reason to want the full picture rather than the useful picture." A beat. "You were separated from your unit based on a manufactured threat assessment. The person who wrote that assessment is still employed, still cleared, still inside the apparatus that Cross and Bosch are using to build their case." She sat very still in the car. The flickering light on level 3 had stopped. The parking structure was quiet and empty, and she was alone in it, and 3 floors below street level with bad signal coverage, and the man on the phone was outside somewhere moving, and Cross did not yet know where she was or why her phone had triggered an SOS. "Give me a name," she said. "Meet me," he said. "Alone." "That's not going to happen." "Then we're done here." "Wait." She said it cleanly, without inflection, the way you stopped a door from closing, not by pleading, but by being faster than the swing. "You called me because you want this to go a specific way. If you just wanted to disappear, you'd have disappeared. You're still here because you need something I can provide. He was quiet. I can put you in front of Bosch, she said, with conditions, with the conversation being on your terms in the ways that actually matter. She paused. But I need the name first, not as a negotiation chip, as proof that what you're telling me is real and not a misdirection. A longer silence than any of the previous ones. Hargrove, he said, Deputy Director of Contracted Intelligence Analysis, Randall Hargrove. He said it with the flatness of someone who'd been carrying the name for a long time and was setting it down. He wrote the threat assessment, he authorized the personnel rotation, and he's been a signatory on every major contracting decision that fed into the Prewitt network for the past 6 years. She had never heard that name, but she believed him. Not because she was credulous, she wasn't, but because the specific quality of what he'd said matched the pattern of things that were true rather than constructed. The 4-year timeline, the manufactured rotation, the institutional position that would explain why the network had survived 14 months of federal investigation without the center of it being identified. Where are you? She said. Near enough, he said. Are we doing this? I need 10 minutes, she said. Don't go anywhere. She hung up and called Cross. He picked up before the first ring completed. Your SOS fired. Are you secure? I'm in the parking structure. I'm fine. She spoke fast and flat. The third contact just called me directly. His name is... I don't have his name, but he has a name I need you to run right now. Randall Hargrove, Deputy Director of Contracted Intelligence Analysis. A silence on Cross's end that told her everything she needed to know about whether the name was real. Where did you get that? His voice had changed, not alarmed, but tightened. He called me. He wants to cooperate, and he wants me as the intermediary because he doesn't trust the existing investigation chain. She waited 1 beat. Is Hargrove inside the chain? Another silence, shorter but heavier. He's a senior advisor on the Oversight Committee for the Task Force Coordination Unit, Cross said. He doesn't have operational authority over our investigation, but he has access to your operational schedule, she said. He's the leak. She could hear Cross doing what he did, the rapid internal assessment, the pressure testing. And she gave him the time to do it because rushing him at this moment would produce worse decisions. The analyst who was suspended, Cross said slowly. She reported to Hargrove's division. Yes, Claire said. She did. The parking structure hummed with the sound of the ventilation system. Somewhere above her, a car door closed. I need you to set the meeting, Cross said. Tell him you'll come alone. We'll set a perimeter. He won't see it, but I need a location. He'll check for surveillance. I know. We'll be far enough out that the approach is clean. A pause. Claire. He used her first name, which he'd done twice before and each time had meant something. You don't have to be the one in the room. He called me, she said. He called me because I'm outside the chain he doesn't trust. If I send someone else, he runs. A beat. Okay, Cross said. Set the meeting. On. The location the caller chose was a diner on the western edge of Harlan Falls, the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and had the particular permanence of businesses that survived by being useful rather than notable. Open 24 hours. Well lit. Public enough that a lone woman meeting a man at a corner booth was unremarkable. He'd chosen well, which told her his training had included threat assessment on both sides of the table. She drove there. She went in and ordered coffee she didn't need and sat in the booth he'd specified, corner, sight lines to both entrances, back to the wall, and waited. He came in at 8:43. She recognized him not by any prior description, but by the way he moved through the door. Scanning without appearing to scan, the particular economical vigilance of someone who'd been doing this long enough that it had become involuntary. Mid-50s. Lean in the way of someone who'd stopped eating full meals some time ago. He had the look of a man who'd been making a specific decision for a very long time and had recently made it differently and wasn't yet sure if that felt like relief or just a different kind of weight. He sat down across from her without a greeting. You're recording this, he said. You'd already assumed that, she said. It shouldn't change what you say. He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he'd expected, she gathered she was adjacent to it, but not quite it. You're younger than I thought. People say that. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Hargrove. He's going to know within 12 hours that Prewitt gave up the network structure. The man, whose name, he told her, was Vincent Arlo, said, "Once he knows that, he'll start burning access points, credentials, records." He looked at the table. "He has a parallel set of documentation that predates the Prewitt operation by several years. Personal copies. Insurance, he called it." "Where?" "Offsite. A storage facility in Billings. Unit registered to a contracting shell company that traces back 3 layers before it connects to him." He looked up. "I can give you the chain." "Why did you wait?" she said. "If you've known about Hargrove, I didn't know all of it until 6 months ago." His jaw tightened. "And when I did, I started doing the math on what cooperating would look like versus what staying quiet would look like. And for a while, the math on staying quiet was survivable, and the math on cooperating was not." He paused. "Prewitt getting arrested changed the math. Because you knew you'd be next. Because I knew Hargrove would make sure I looked like the architect instead of the analyst." He said it without self-pity, which she found more credible than anguish would have been. "I built the models. I ran the vulnerability assessments on transport routes. On paper, I'm the operational brain, and Hargrove is a bureaucrat who happened to sign some approvals." He looked at her directly. "I need someone to understand the sequence. What I did, and when I started doing it, and who was directing it." She looked at him across the table of a 40-year-old diner at 8:45 in the evening, while Cross's team maintained a perimeter she couldn't see, and the coffee she wasn't drinking went cold in the cup. "Tell me about the compromise," she said. "The Northern Theater. What really happened?" He told her. It took 40 minutes, and she didn't interrupt once, and by the end of it she understood things she had spent 2.5 years not understanding. The specific sequence of events that had ended her service, the manufactured threat assessment, the name of the contractor whose report had triggered the personnel rotation, and the signature at the bottom of the authorization that had sent her and 4 other operators into civilian life under terms that were designed to be silencing. Randall Hargrove's signature on a document that had never been shown to her, that she had never been given the right to contest, that had simply arrived as a decision, framed as protection, accepted because she'd been 29 and had trusted the apparatus she'd served and had not yet learned, was learning now, in this booth, in this diner, the full specific shape of what that trust had cost her. She sat with it for a moment after Arlo finished. "I need to make a call," she said. "I know," he said. She called Cross. She gave him the storage facility information, the address, the shell company chain, the unit number. She did it concisely and completely. Then she said, "He's ready to come in." Cross's team came through the diner's rear entrance 3 minutes later. Arlo went with them without incident, not because he had no choice, but because he'd already made his choice. And the going with them was just the physical expression of something he'd decided somewhere in the past 6 months when the math changed. She drove to the safe house. She slept without dreaming. Randall Hargrove was arrested at 6:14 the following morning at his home in Arlington, Virginia, by a joint federal team that had been staged and waiting before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. The storage unit in Billings was accessed simultaneously under an emergency warrant. The parallel documentation Arlo had described was exactly where he'd said it would be. 4 years of records in a fireproof case that Hargrove had apparently maintained with the particular diligence of someone who understood that insurance only worked if it was intact. It was the records themselves that made the case unassailable. Hargrove had documented everything. Not carelessly. He wasn't a careless man, but systematically. The way people documented things when they wanted to ensure that if the structure ever collapsed, they could demonstrate that they'd been the architect rather than the casualty. The records contained authorizations, communications, threat assessments, including the one that had ended Claire's service, and 4 years of correspondence with Prewitt that established the network's chain of command with the kind of clarity that made prosecutors efficient and defense attorneys quiet. Cross called her at 8:30 to tell her. She was in the safe house kitchen eating toast that had come out slightly burned because she'd misjudged the age of the toaster, and she listened to him run through the summary with the unhurried focus of someone who was tired and didn't need things to be more dramatic than they were. "The threat assessment," she said when he finished. "The one from the Northern Theater. It's in the records. Dated, signed, with the original source document that it was supposedly based on, which doesn't say what the assessment claimed it said." A pause. "Your separation and the separations of 4 other personnel from that unit were based on a document that misrepresented its own source material." She looked at the burned toast. That can be corrected, she said. It wasn't quite a question. It's already in motion, Cross said. There's a formal review process for separation records. Given the documentation we have, it's not going to be a long process. Another pause. You'll receive formal notification through official channels, but I wanted you to hear it first. She thought about what she wanted to say and what she found, sitting in a safe house kitchen with burned toast and bad coffee and the particular gray light of a Montana morning, was that she didn't have a clean response to it. 2.5 years of a specific kind of silence. The silence of something that had happened to her and been framed as something done for her. And now the official record was going to say something different, and she didn't know yet what to do with that difference, except hold it carefully and not be too fast about deciding what it meant. Thank you, she said. It was insufficient and accurate. Thank yourself, Cross said. You did more of this than you should have had to. The formal hospital review began 10 days after Hargrove's arrest. It was convened by the hospital's governing board in response to the federal investigation's findings, which had included Redstone Valley's systemic security vulnerabilities as a contributing factor in the network's operational capability. The scope was expanded, at Hale's own written request, to include a review of departmental culture, staff management practices, and the formal grievance records, or lack thereof, going back 18 months. Claire was asked to provide a written statement. Then she was asked to attend a session in person. She did both, and she said what was true without ornamentation, which was that the emergency department at Redstone Valley had several nurses and support staff who were exceptionally good at their jobs and had been consistently evaluated against a standard that had more to do with visibility than competence, and that the correction of this was not complicated. It required people in authority to be willing to look at what was actually in front of them rather than what they expected to see. She said it in a conference room with 6 board members, 2 external reviewers, and Hale sitting at the far end of the table with the expression of a man attending his own accounting and not looking away from it, which she had to give him credit for. The review took 3 weeks. The findings, when they came, were specific and consequential. Mandatory restructuring of evaluation protocols, a formal corrective process for staff members whose records reflected patterns of dismissal rather than genuine performance assessment, and a departmental leadership review that resulted in Hale's removal from the chief of department position pending a 6-month remediation process before he could be considered for a reduced administrative role. He was not fired. She hadn't wanted him fired. Firing him would have been clean and insufficient, both at once. What she'd wanted, what she hadn't known she wanted until the board delivered it, was for him to have to do the harder thing, which was to remain in the building he'd run badly and learn, in proximity to the people he'd dismissed, how to run it differently. She ran into him in the corridor 3 days after the findings were released. He stopped when he saw her. He looked like he hadn't slept especially well and was doing it anyway, which she understood. The remediation panel asked me to identify someone in the department to consult on the new evaluation framework, he said. She waited. I put your name forward, he said. If you're willing. She looked at him. The version of this conversation she'd imagined, in the abstract, during the 2.5 years before any of this happened, had involved more satisfaction than she actually felt. What she felt instead was something closer to tired practicality. The acknowledgement that this was the right outcome, that it would produce better results for the people who mattered most in the equation, which was the staff and the patients, and that the part of her which had expected vindication to feel like something bigger than this needed to adjust its expectations. Yes, she said. I'm willing. Teller was discharged from the northern facility 22 days after his admission. She didn't know this immediately. She found out when Cross mentioned it in passing during a follow-up call about the formal record review timeline, and she filed it away without comment. But 9 days after that, on a Thursday afternoon when her shift ended at 6, and the autumn had settled into Harlan Falls with the particular gray-gold quality of October in Montana, she came out of the hospital's side entrance and found him standing near the parking structure in civilian clothes, leaning against a car with the careful posture of someone whose ribs were still asking questions about last month. You look better, she said. I look terrible, he said, but I'm vertical, which is the metric I care about. He straightened slowly. I wanted to come in person. They told me you'd be out around 6. Cross told you. Cross told me, He looked at her with the steady, direct attention she remembered from the ICU room. I talked to the review board about the corridor, about what you did. You didn't have to do that. I know. He paused. I also talked to some people about the threat assessment from the Northern Theater, the one about your unit. He said it carefully, watching her face. I served with 2 of the other 4 people who were rotated out on the same authorization. They're glad someone's correcting the record. She looked at the parking structure. The light on level 3 was still flickering. Someone had finally put in the maintenance request, and it still hadn't been fixed, which was so consistent with the ongoing reality of institutional life that she almost laughed. How are you doing? She said. Really? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the right way to treat it. Physically? Better than I should be, apparently. My doctors use the word remarkable, which I don't trust because doctors say that when they mean they weren't sure you'd make it. He paused. Otherwise, I'm working on it. She understood what he meant by that. She understood it specifically and didn't need him to elaborate. There's a program, he said, a training initiative, field trauma response for military transport medics, civilian crossover protocols. He looked at her. Cross and Bosch are involved in putting it together. It came out of the gap analysis from the Route 9 response. The finding that civilian medical staff in high-incident transport corridors often have no framework for the kind of triage that's needed when a military casualty presents without documentation or support. She watched him. They're looking for someone to help design the curriculum, he said, and to train the first cohort, someone who knows both sides of the wall. He paused. Cross said to tell you it's not an order, it's a conversation, and that you can tell him to go to hell if you want to. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the conversation she'd had in the ICU room in the dim of early morning, and the one in the federal facility hallway with bad coffee, and the one in the diner with a man who'd been making the wrong choices for years and had finally stopped, and the one in this parking structure in a car with a flickering light overhead, while a voice on the phone told her about a document that had ended something she'd loved without her permission. She thought about the teenager in Bay 4 whose fracture she'd caught before it became a complication, the woman with the UTI that had gone too long, the patient in the ICU whose face she'd been watching when everyone else was watching the monitor. It's not going back, she said. Not to him specifically, to herself mostly, with him there to hear it. No, he said, it's something else. She thought about that. Something else. Not the task force and not the program and not the life she'd had before 31 months of classified work in places she couldn't name, but also not the 2.5 years of deliberate smallness, of keeping things narrow and manageable and invisible, of being the nurse everyone forgot to look at. Tell Cross I'll have the conversation, she said. Teller nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer, which was fine. Some things were predictable not because they were inevitable, but because they were right, and the rightness of them made the path between the question and the answer shorter than it would otherwise be. One more thing, he said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, the movement careful and deliberate, the way all his movements were careful now, and held out a folded piece of paper. This is from the other 4, the ones who were rotated out with you. She took it. She didn't open it in front of him. She folded it again and put it in her pocket and looked at him in the gray-gold October light of a parking structure on the edge of Harlan Falls, Montana, and said, "Thank you for coming in person." "Thank you for the hallway," he said, both times. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a minute before she started the engine, and she took the folded paper from her pocket and opened it. It was handwritten, 5 names at the top, 4 she didn't recognize, and then hers, listed with theirs. Below the names, in handwriting that was clearly not the same person across all 5 contributions, a single sentence that had apparently been agreed upon collectively. "We knew what you were. We're glad the record will too." She folded it back up and put it in her pocket and started the car and drove toward the northern edge of Harlan Falls, where the safe house was, which was still her current address because her apartment remained a question she hadn't answered yet, and she drove through the gray-gold October light with the windows up and the heater running and did not perform any emotion about what had just happened. But she let herself feel it. That was the distinction she'd learned, over 31 months of work she'd loved and 2.5 years of silence she'd managed, and 1 week in a hospital that had become something she hadn't anticipated. The distinction between performing and feeling, between the discipline of containment and the much harder discipline of actually allowing something to land. it landed. The last piece came quietly, the way important things sometimes did, not in a conference room or a federal facility or a parking structure at the end of a long shift, but in the ordinary flow of a Thursday afternoon when she was back on rotation at Redstone Valley, 11 days after Teller's visit, and the department was running at its usual midweek tempo. The board had named an interim department chief. His name was Garrett Osei, a trauma surgeon from the second floor who'd been at Redstone Valley for 7 years and had the particular quality of paying attention to what was actually in the room, which Claire had observed and respected from a distance without ever saying so. He ran morning rounds differently than Hale had, less as a performance of authority, more as an actual information exchange. And the department had responded to this the way most departments responded to being treated as if they were competent, by being slightly more competent. She was in Bay 3 at 2 in the afternoon when Osei stopped at the curtain. Dawson. Dr. Osei. The curriculum committee meets next Thursday. Cross's team sent over the initial framework document. He held out a folder. I marked a few places where the civilian triage protocols don't account for the documentation gap in unidentified military casualties. Thought you might want to look at it before the meeting. She took the folder. There's also a staff meeting next Friday, he said. I'm introducing the new evaluation framework. I'd like you to co-present the nurse assessment section. She looked at him. You have the floor knowledge, he said simply, and the credibility. He said this without ceremony, the way factual things should be said. See you Thursday. He walked away, and she stood in Bay 3 with a folder in one hand and the ordinary noise of the department around her, the monitors, the intercom, the particular layered texture of a hospital doing what it did. And she thought about the first morning she'd walked in here 2 years and 4 months ago, with coffee she'd made at home because the break room machine was broken, and how she'd stood at the board and read the day's assignments and had already been shrinking herself to fit the space she'd been given. She was done with that. Not in the dramatic way of someone announcing a transformation. She wasn't built for announcements, and the transformation hadn't been an event, but a sequence of small decisions made under pressure in corridors and parking structures and federal buildings and a corner booth in a diner at the edge of town. She was done with it the way you were done with a habit that had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. Not with ceremony, but with the quiet finality of something set down rather than discarded. She opened the folder and started reading. The protocol gaps Osei had marked were real and specific, and she had thoughts about each of them. Thoughts grounded in 31 months of experience that was no longer a redaction, but a resource. She made notes in the margin with the pen she kept clipped to her badge, and by the time the patient in Bay 3 was ready for reassessment, she had 3 pages of margin notes and a clear picture of what Thursday's meeting needed to accomplish. She put the folder aside and did the reassessment. She did it with the same quality of attention she'd given every patient in every bay for 2 years and 4 months. Not because she'd been performing excellence in the hope of recognition, but because the patients were the reason she was there, before everything else, underneath everything else. And that had been true when Hale was dismissing her in morning rounds, and it was true now and would be true in whatever came next. That was the thing people didn't always understand about quiet strength. Not that it was patient, though it was, and not that it was strategic, though it could be. It was that it came from actually caring about the work. The people who underestimated her had been looking for the wrong indicators. They'd been looking for someone who performed competence loudly, who announced herself, who made sure the room knew when she was the most qualified person in it. And because she didn't do those things, because she had learned to move through rooms like someone with nothing to prove, they'd concluded she had nothing to offer. They'd been wrong in the specific way that people were wrong when they mistook someone's stillness for absence. She'd been still. She'd been watching. She'd been ready. And when the moment had come, not the moment she'd prepared for or planned toward, but the moment that arrived in a hallway at the worst possible time, she had simply done what she knew how to do. The rest had followed. Not because the world rewarded the deserving on any reliable schedule. It didn't, and she had no illusions about that. It had followed because other people had done their part too. Cross with his careful precision, Bosch with her controlled intelligence, Teller with his stubborn pulse and his dry humor, Arlo with his late and costly honesty, even Hale with his incomplete but genuine accounting. None of them perfect, all of them necessary. That was the other thing people missed, she thought, finishing the reassessment and updating the chart. The The story of someone being underestimated and then vindicated got told as if it were about one person's interior, their strength, their endurance, their eventual triumph. But the truth of it was more complicated and more interesting. The truth was that it was also about the people who eventually chose to look, who got it wrong first and then, slowly or suddenly, got it less wrong, who didn't have to do that but did. The world didn't change because one person refused to disappear. It changed because enough people around them decided, finally, to see clearly. Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in Montana, going golden and long and then going fast, the way good things sometimes did. She had 4 more hours on her shift. Thursday's meeting needed preparation. The flickering light on level 3 of the parking structure still hadn't been fixed, and she was going to put in that maintenance request herself tomorrow because some things you just did. She clipped her pen back to her badge and walked out of Bay 3 and back into the department, her department now, in the way that any place became yours when you stopped treating it as temporary. And the monitors kept their rhythm, and the intercom called names she knew, and she moved through it all with the particular ease of someone who had stopped performing smallness and started taking up exactly the space she was entitled to. Not more, not less. Exactly that. Teller was discharged from the northern facility 22 days after his admission. She didn't know this immediately. She found out when Cross mentioned it in passing during a follow-up call about the formal record review timeline, and she filed it away without comment. But 9 days after that, on a Thursday afternoon when her shift ended at 6 and the autumn had settled into Harlan Falls with the particular gray-gold quality of October in Montana, she came out of the hospital's side entrance and found him standing near the parking structure in civilian clothes, leaning against a car with the careful posture of someone whose ribs were still asking questions about last month. "You look better," she said. "I look terrible," he said, "but I'm vertical, which is the metric I care about." He straightened slowly. "I wanted to come in person. They told me you'd be out around 6. "Cross told you." "Cross told me." He looked at her with steady, direct attention she remembered from the ICU room. "I talked to the review board, about the corridor, about what you did. You didn't have to do that." "I know." He paused. "I also talked to some people about the threat assessment from the Northern Theater, the one about your unit." He said it carefully, watching her face. "I served with 2 of the other 4 people who were rotated out on the same authorization. They're glad someone's correcting the record." She looked at the parking structure. The light on level 3 was still flickering. Someone had finally put in the maintenance request and it still hadn't been fixed, which was so consistent with the ongoing reality of institutional life that she almost laughed. "How are you doing?" she said. "Really?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the right way to treat it. "Physically? Better than I should be, apparently. My doctors use the word remarkable, which I don't trust because doctors say that when they mean they weren't sure you'd make it." He paused. "Otherwise, I'm working on it." She understood what he meant by that. She understood it specifically and didn't need him to elaborate. "There's a program," he said, "a training initiative, field trauma response for military transport medics, civilian crossover protocols." He looked at her. "Cross and Bosch are involved in putting it together. It came out of the gap analysis from the Route 9 response, the finding that civilian medical staff in high-incident transport corridors often have no framework for the kind of triage that's needed when a military casualty presents without documentation or support." She watched him. "They're looking for someone to help design the curriculum," he said, "and to train the first cohort, someone who knows both sides of the wall." He paused. "Cross said to tell you it's not an order, it's a conversation, and that you can tell him to go to hell if you want to." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the conversation she'd had in the ICU room in the dim of early morning, and the one in the federal facility hallway with bad coffee, and the one in the diner with a man who'd been making the wrong choices for years and had finally stopped, and the one in this parking structure in a car with a flickering light overhead, while a voice on the phone told her about a document that had ended something she'd loved without her permission. She thought about the teenager in Bay 4, whose fracture she'd caught before it became a complication. The woman with the UTI that had gone too long. The patient in the ICU whose face she'd been watching when everyone else was watching the monitor. "It's not going back," she said. Not to him specifically, to herself mostly, with him there to hear it. "No," he said. "It's something else." She thought about that. Something else. Not the task force and not the program and not the life she'd had before 31 months of classified work in places she couldn't name, but also not the 2.5 years of deliberate smallness, of keeping things narrow and manageable and invisible, of being the nurse everyone forgot to look at. "Tell Cross I'll have the conversation," she said. Teller nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer, which was fine. Some things were predictable not because they were inevitable, but because they were right, and the rightness of them made the path between the question and the answer shorter than it would otherwise be. "One more thing," he said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, the movement careful and deliberate, the way all his movements were careful now, and held out a folded piece of paper. "This is from the other 4, the ones who were rotated out with you." She took it. She didn't open it in front of him. She folded it again and put it in her pocket and looked at him in the gray-gold October light of a parking structure on the edge of Harlan Falls, Montana, and said, "Thank you for coming in person." "Thank you for the hallway," he said, both times. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a minute before she started the engine, and she took the folded paper from her pocket and opened it. It was handwritten, 5 names at the top, 4 she didn't recognize, and then hers, listed with theirs. Below the names, in handwriting that was clearly not the same person across all 5 contributions, a single sentence that had apparently been agreed upon collectively. "We knew what you were. We're glad the record will too." She folded it back up and put it in her pocket and started the car and drove toward the northern edge of Harlan Falls where the safe house was, which was still her current address because her apartment remained a question she hadn't answered yet, and she drove through the gray-gold October light with the windows up and the heater running and did not perform any emotion about what had just happened. But she let herself feel it. That was the distinction she'd learned, over 31 months of work she'd loved, and 2.5 years of silence she'd managed, and 1 week in a hospital that had become something she hadn't anticipated. The distinction between performing and feeling, between the discipline of containment and the much harder discipline of actually allowing something to land. It landed. The last piece came quietly, the way important things sometimes did, not in a conference room or a federal facility or a parking structure at the end of a long shift, but in the ordinary flow of a Thursday afternoon when she was back on a rotation at Redstone Valley, 11 days after Teller's visit, and the department was running at its usual midweek tempo. The board had named an interim department chief. His name was Garrett Osei, a trauma surgeon from the 2nd floor who'd been at Redstone Valley for 7 years and had the particular quality of paying attention to what was actually in the room, which Claire had observed and respected from a distance without ever saying so. He ran morning rounds differently than Hale had, less as a performance of authority, more as an actual information exchange. And the department had responded to this the way most departments responded to being treated as if they were competent, by being slightly more competent. She was in Bay 3 at 2 in the afternoon when Osei stopped at the curtain. "Dawson." "Dr. Osei." "The curriculum committee meets next Thursday. Cross's team sent over the initial framework document." He held out a folder. "I marked a few places where the civilian triage protocols don't account for the documentation gap in unidentified military casualties. Thought you might want to look at it before the meeting." She took the folder. "There's also a staff meeting next Friday," he said. "I'm introducing the new evaluation framework. I'd like you to co-present the nurse assessment section." She looked at him. "You have the floor knowledge," he said simply, "and the credibility." He said this without ceremony, the way factual things should be said. "See you Thursday." He walked away, and she stood in Bay 3 with a folder in one hand and the ordinary noise of the department around her, the monitors, the intercom, the particular layered texture of a hospital doing what it did. And she thought about the first morning she'd walked in here 2 years and 4 months ago with coffee she'd made at home, because the break room machine was broken, and how she'd stood at the board and read the day's assignments and had already been shrinking herself to fit the space she'd been given. She was done with that. Not in the dramatic way of someone announcing a transformation. She wasn't built for announcements, and the transformation hadn't been an event, but a sequence of small decisions made under pressure in corridors and parking structures in federal buildings and a corner booth in a diner at the edge of town. She was done with it the way you were done with a habit that had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. Not with ceremony, but with the quiet finality of something set down rather than discarded. She opened the folder and started reading. The protocol gaps Ose had marked were real and specific, and she had thoughts about each of them. Thoughts grounded in 31 months of experience that was no longer a redaction, but a resource. She made notes in the margin with the pen she kept clipped to her badge, and by the time the patient in Bay 3 was ready for reassessment, she had 3 pages of margin notes and a clear picture of what Thursday's meeting needed to accomplish. She put the folder aside and did the reassessment. She did it with the same quality of attention she'd given every patient in every bay for 2 years and 4 months. Not because she'd been performing excellence in the hope of recognition, but because the patients were the reason she was there, before everything else, underneath everything else. And that had been true when Hale was dismissing her in morning rounds, and it was true now, and would be true in whatever came next. That was the thing people didn't always understand about quiet strength. Not that it was patient, though it was, and not that it was strategic, though it could be. It was that it came from actually caring about the work. The people who underestimated her had been looking for the wrong indicators. They'd been looking for someone who performed competence loudly, who announced herself, who made sure the room knew when she was the most qualified person in it. And because she didn't do those things, because she had learned to move through rooms like someone with nothing to prove, they'd concluded she had nothing to offer. They'd been wrong in the specific way that people were wrong when they mistook someone's stillness for absence. She'd been still, she'd been watching, she'd been ready. And when the moment had come, not the moment she'd prepared for or planned toward, but the moment that arrived in a hallway at the worst possible time, she had simply done what she knew how to do. The rest had followed. Not because the world rewarded the deserving on any reliable schedule. It didn't, and she had no illusions about that. It had followed because other people had done their part too. Cross with his careful precision, Bosch with her controlled intelligence, Teller with his stubborn pulse and his dry humor, Arlo with his late and costly honesty, even Hale with his incomplete but genuine accounting. None of them perfect, all of them necessary. That was the other thing people missed, she thought, finishing the reassessment and updating the chart. The story of someone being underestimated and then vindicated got told as if it were about one person's interior, their strength, their endurance, their eventual triumph. But the truth of it was more complicated and more interesting. The truth was that it was also about the people who eventually chose to look, who got it wrong first and then, slowly or suddenly, got it less wrong, who didn't have to do that but did. The world didn't change because one person refused to disappear. It changed because enough people around them decided, finally, to see clearly. Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in Montana, going golden and long and then going fast, the way good things sometimes did. She had 4 more hours on her shift. Thursday's meeting needed preparation. The flickering light on level 3 of the parking structure still hadn't been fixed, and she was going to put in that maintenance request herself tomorrow because some things you just did. She clipped her pen back to her badge and walked out of Bay 3 and back into the department, her department now, in the way that any place became yours when you stopped treating it as temporary. And the monitors kept their rhythm, and the intercom called names she knew, and she moved through it all with the particular ease of someone who had stopped performing smallness and started taking up exactly the space she was entitled to. Not more, not less. Exactly that.